So CEO Optimism, Bob, at a 10-year high, despite all those headwinds I just described. Why is that?
Well, as we asked the question of the CEO survey, we're focused on two things. How will GDP look from a global perspective, and can they raise revenues in the next 12 months? As one of your earlier speakers, David Costin from Goldman, said, the CEOs have proven over the last 2 years that even facing a tremendous amount of headwinds, be it supply chain, people not in the office, the questions around the consumer, or other aspects like that, they've demonstrated a degree of resiliency and been able to increase both the revenue as well as the margin. So that confidence level still continues. The second thing I would say is that they are doing a great job of engaging with their customers. The more engagement, reaction to, and trust amongst their customers, the more confidence they have, both in terms of overall optimism, but also their ability to manage for growth, either by more market share, by longer sustainability with those customers, or by managing the price increases that are going to be needed because of supply chain challenges.
And of course, they've been managing that the whole time against the backdrop of a global pandemic. Do CEOs see that pandemic easing, or are they just getting better at navigating it?
I think they're getting better at navigating it. I think we do generally see, since the time we've done the survey, a clear up and down roller coaster ride because of the latest variant of COVID. But having said that, coming through the new year right now, you do have the CEOs being a little bit more confident and easing when you look at the data, both in terms of the speed by which the variant is going through this and the lessening effects that it's had on individuals, even though we still have a tragedy relevant to the healthcare implications associated with that. That's giving them confidence for the remainder of this year. As we look out for a light at the end of the tunnel, that's another reason for the boost as they think about the next 12 months ahead.
Bob, you mentioned David Costin, and he was also worried and disappointed that we're not seeing more forward-looking guidance coming from CEOs on the S&P 500. So what are you seeing in terms of that confidence translating to perhaps some allocations and changes in the way that they do business in 2022?
Yeah, it's clear that there's concerns over a number of different areas. When we ask the questions about risks, for example, those issues around macroeconomics, when you think about the healthcare scare, cyber continues to be one that's very expensive as you've had much more digitization and expenditure in the digital space. So as CEOs are looking forward, there's a couple of things that are happening. Number one, they're trying to manage as best they can free cash flow. The wage increase, in particular with the Great Resignation, is a big challenge. We see that coming through some of the details. The second thing is you are seeing CEOs change in terms of their preferences of where to invest. Asia, for example, is a great example of this. You've seen a rise in terms of those CEOs that are willing to invest outside of their home countries. They're pivoting to both the U.S., so there's a gap now between the U.S. and China. And second, you're seeing a lot more investment on a cross north and south basis across the region. The optimism in Asia, with the exception of China, was probably at the record high, relatively speaking. So you see Asia as a big upside potential, and that cuts across both the southern part of Asia as well as the northern part, with China being the exception.
Have there been any commitments that have fallen to the wayside? Of course, you have mentioned some of those challenges like inflation, labor costs. So what are businesses not prioritizing as much as they did before?
Well, when you look, many of them have dealt with the larger transformation. Their big focus right now is how do I get the return from that investment, that change, both in terms of how do I manage a supply chain, how do I manage my customer experience, how do I manage my workforce, and bring ESG into the agenda. It's an interesting one because we would argue that, for example, in managing supply chain, Asia's got a particularly upside potential if they digitize it to manage supply and demand much more aggressively and agilely than ever before. And second, if they bring ESG to the table, that'll be a big opportunity because the rest of the world's going to be looking for that. So that issue has not gone away, even though the commitments have come slower. The reason they're coming slower is because small to medium-sized enterprises either think they don't have a big role to play or they feel they're unable to manage for the ESG agenda, either in terms of measuring it, monitoring it, or actually taking the actions to make a difference going forward.
Bob, the big news story this week for us has been monetary policy, of course, and a potentially more hawkish Fed and a rollback in those monetary policies and support. And of course, at the same time, we're seeing some of those fiscal stimulus being rolled back as well. How is that being factored into CEOs' thinking right now?
rising cost structure, and that goes to not only interest rates, but also wage inflation and supply chain inflation as we see it. So managing for cost right now and trying to eke out as much as you possibly can in terms of your margins, usually important. The second piece of the pie here is how, in fact, CEOs are going to think about managing for liquidity. Those at the bottom end of the barrel, so to speak, that have been managing through a real low or negative or stable interest rate environment have survived. We've talked about the zombie companies for the last 2 to 3 years now, even on these kind of broadcasts. So those companies are really going to be struggling with the amount of debt that they have picked up over the years. So cash flow is going to be a real challenge as you look forward. Last point, scenario planning. There's too much uncertainty, not only with COVID, but also you look at the issues in Russia, you look at some of the clamping down happening in China, you look at the resignation issues, you look at the monetary and fiscal policies. Scenario planning is something that the CEOs are focusing on to be ready, willing, and able to move and move fast. So being agile, faster, quicker decision-making, and thinking about how we take everything from supply chain to customer experience and all the price points in between.